President Clinton had just arrived in Washington. And one of the things, unwisely I think, that President Clinton had agreed to do on the campaign trail was his first executive order would be to allow gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military. He said it, but he didn't lay any groundwork. He didn't establish a commission or bring together policymakers or senior enlisted officers to build support for it. At his first press conference, and after he was elected in Little Rock, the first question he got was, "Mr. President, do you still intend that allowing gays and lesbians to serve in the military will be your first executive order?" "Absolutely," he said. But this was also the presidential candidate who had vowed to cut the defense budget by 25%. So the background and the context in which he was arriving in Washington was he'd already set up a hostile environment with the Pentagon. President Clinton didn't realize, wasn't aware of, how important the military would be to make a major policy change. It'd be very hard to do that without the leadership. And Sam Nunn was chairman of the Armed Services Committee at that point, and he was very hostile. And John Warner was the ranking minority, and he was hostile to the concept or idea of gays and lesbians serving openly. So what Sam Nunn did was he called all the chiefs before the committee, and the question was from Senator Nunn, do you think homosexuality is compatible with military service? And they went down the line and asked each chief, and they all responded no. And Colin Powell was actually perhaps because he was the chairman, but he elaborated beyond the no and went in greater detail. So he was a very fierce opponent. But what Don't Ask, Don't Tell required was that these young service members, and keep in mind most of the military force is under the age of 30. So we're talking about individuals between 17 and 29. But what this compromise, so-called compromise, required them to lie about who they were, to deny who they were. And that took shape in all, manner and form, every day, actually. But the irony is that certainly for most of the service academies in the military, but the West Point creed is I will not lie. It begins, I will not lie, or cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. But it begins, I will not lie. And yet, the Congress passes a federal law, a federal statute. It actually becomes a federal statute requiring service members to lie. And in a way, requiring other service members to be a part of that lie. Service members above in rank and below in rank. Under President Obama, General Powell did come to change his views. He didn't testify again, but I know that Valerie Jarrett and others in the White House, I don't think the president was involved, but I know that Valerie and others reached out to him, and he came around and changed his position and quietly supported the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So in that sense, he came full circle. But you do have to remember the context under which he came into office. There was a financial crisis, and that was his immediate priority, trying to deal with that the first 90, 120 days. And I basically said to the senior White House staff and others, don't expect you to do anything in 100 days. But after 100 days, we do have to have a plan of how we're going to get this done. And we really got to get this done in this, your first Congress, because that's when most of the big initiatives are going to happen. Now, repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell was not one of his top priorities. And rightly so, I think getting health care was his top legislative priority. And he invested and put most of his chits there. So yes, we had to push the senior staff at the White House, met 2 or 3 times with the president. He became engaged very late in the process in terms of what I saw. I think he was more engaged with Secretary Gates and Jay Johnson, who was then the general counsel at DOD. And Gates was not, he was very, very late too, coming to the repeal corner. Somewhat surprising, we had within the LGBT community and the so-called leaders, there were different priorities in terms of what was the most important to push the administration on. HRC, the Human Rights Campaign organization, wanted ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And that was perfectly fine, except from my view, the votes were not there for ENDA, to pass ENDA. They weren't there in the Senate for sure. And I felt like, having been a creature of the Senate, having worked there 14 years, I had pretty good sense of where the votes were on repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell and on ENDA. And the argument I made, there is a path to getting 60 votes. And we always knew we would have to invoke cloture. We would have to get 60 votes. We just couldn't get a majority. That's what we were dealing with. So some differences on priorities within the LGBT community. And then the people like Jim Messina, who is the president's point person on the issue, engaging with the Hill. I think Jim saw it as a very difficult issue. He was also concerned about the next election cycle, that it might be a tough vote for some members in the House and the Senate. And I think initially Jim was of the view that this should wait at least 2 years, if not 4. And that's where Jim and I butted heads, is that obviously I felt it was my job to push back on that. And some difficult times with Jim on that. But I was surprised by the intensity of the opposition from some of the senior staff initially. And when I say initially, I mean pretty much the first year. And the level of opposition from Secretary Gates, that was somewhat surprising, because he was known as the ultimate insider in Washington, a survivor, having served 4 or 5 presidents, having served a Republican president, before Obama as secretary, and then coming back as secretary initially. Now he too came on board late in the second year. He could have stopped it. That was the interesting thing about, and I always recognized that he could have stopped it. But more importantly, President Obama, unlike President Clinton, President Obama knew that he had to bring the Pentagon with him to achieve this. That he couldn't go down the road that Clinton had. It was very, very important to get buy-in from the Pentagon. And my view was, it was critical not only for their actual buy-in, but if you look historically for major policy changes. Eventually, notwithstanding the initial opposition to President Truman's executive order to end segregation in the ranks, eventually the Joint Chiefs, they came aboard. And even though it took a few years, we did end segregation in the ranks in the armed forces. So I saw a parallel there for us in terms of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. If we could persuade, arguably, the largest and perhaps the most conservative federal agency to support gays and lesbians serving openly in the military, that would pave the way for greater acceptance, not only across the federal government and state governments, but with the general population as well. The media was very interested in the issue. And one of the things that we did at Servicemembers Legal Defense Network, which I was a part of, basically we were primarily a legal services organization representing these young men and women who were caught up in don't ask, don't tell and being discharged. But we were also the advocates for repeal. And we worked with the Congress in drafting the legislation to repeal don't ask, don't tell. I always saw it as that the media there was a certain element of fascination about the issue. It was also young people, and young people who were willing to tell their stories. And we thought that was very important, getting them front and center. For many, they had already been discharged, and they just didn't want to go away quietly. They wanted to be a part of the debate and be a part of bringing about a change. And for the service members who were under investigation, that was more challenging, because if we had brought them front and center before the media or social media, they would have outed themselves, and that would have been a violation of don't ask, don't tell, and they would have been subject to discharge. So again, it's another parallel with ending racial segregation in the Pentagon. You could see that, the black and the white divide. With don't ask, don't tell, to see it front and center did require a number of service members stepping forward and saying who they were and who they had been, and how proud they were of their honorable service. But my view was that all of these young people had been wronged by their government, by the Pentagon, and I was always in awe of how willing they were to fight back. When we repealed don't ask, don't tell, that we didn't bring transgender service members and candidates or applicants into that debate was because they were not prohibited from serving. They served under medical regulations and still did under the Trump administration and still are. But don't ask, don't tell was a federal statute which prohibited gays and lesbians and bisexuals from serving. Now, we did have debate internally about should we include transgender in the drafting of the legislation or be supportive of an amendment. And my feeling, and I think the majority of the board, was that the fear was that the amendment or the new language would be defeated. And then the transgender service members would have a federal statute, which they did not have before. But the downside was another president could come along and change the medical regs. Now, unfortunately, the Obama administration was working on the transgender regulations, and the final changes did not get made before Obama left office. So this is something that the Pentagon took far too long on, too many years, and then President Trump, at the urging of, ironically, Gina Thomas, the wife of our Supreme Court Justice, and this fellow named Perkins, I think it's, who's head of the Family Council. Those two went to the president, and a couple of weeks later, via tweet, President Trump issued the ban on transgender service members. But the good news is the new president, Biden, has taken care of that. There is still some work to be done on that at the Pentagon, and I'm hoping they will finish it. But you asked about the old organization. So this new organization, which has a big focus on families, has been working on transgender service, and they have a lot to celebrate this month that has happened. But with the repeal of don't ask, don't tell, and there's still some issues involving LGBT service members, but there's not a big legal staff that we had 20 years ago working on these issues. And the good news is there isn't a need for that kind of those legal resources today. Well, it was a big cultural shift for our country, for our society. I think it's had a tremendous impact. I'm not entirely sure that had we failed, had we not been successful in getting that statute repealed, I'm not altogether sure that there would be gay marriage today. And I'm not altogether certain that the Defense of Marriage Act would have gone away. But, so it was very important to win that. It was a big deal, I think, not just for the LGBT community, but for our country.